Hi there. Welcome back to Brains, Minds, and Consciousness. Today we're going to get a little more into some of the fundamental features of the way that minds can piece together ideas from stimuli and our own responses. Uh, so, and to do so, we're going to examine two phenomena: the habituation, something that our brains do quite a lot of, and then move on to a little bit of behaviorism and talk about classical conditioning. So, to pick up the thread, where were we last time? We continued our tour through history as we like to do, looking at different ways that actual science came to bear on studying how the mind works, right? Our friends Helmholtz and company. So from there, we saw how information comes into the neurons, and that is sort of a transformation that means it must be distinct from the stimuli that cause them. Not little copies of trees entering our eyeballs and staying that way, but more some kind of stimulation causes this chain reaction of neural firing, right? And then we also looked at how, some of the ways to conceptualize how knowledge works in our memories and just in our everyday of being able to perceive it directly. And so the idea being that we take patterns from the world, and especially the if you remember the laws of association, resemblance, contiguity, and causation, or also known as contingency, and then we're able to actually take continuously appearing patterns and kind of create these hypotheses that we can test to make new knowledge and explore the world and all that. So that's some of the bases we've covered in this exploration of how the mind begins to work, right? And from here, we'll talk about we're going to dig a little bit more into this association game, right? So association. How do we connect two ideas, um, or ideas being many kinds of things, ideas, stimuli, actual responses that we have to things in the world, um, and that's the basic idea: connecting different, distinct ideas. But before we get too far into how we connect separate ideas, let's talk about something that we it's just a fundamental feature of how we deal with individual ideas. Ideas being, neural firings, sometimes in response to the world, and sometimes just, in response to ourselves. But here's one specific way that minds handle repeat exposure to the same kinds of stimulus, and that is habituation. So when we're repeatedly exposed to a stimulus, we become habituated to it. The most common sense way to think of this is we become, we get used to the stimulus. Um, so, if, for instance, here's a dude as we've been using, a little dude with feet, and we go bang, right? Create a bang sound. Well, this person is upset with this. They don't like hearing a loud bang sound in their ears, just like I did to you. Sorry. Um, and that but the idea is that if I just kept making the same bang sound, you'd start to lose interest, right? Just at the highest level, at the most like common sense level. And that's this concept that repetition makes any given stimulus causes less and less of a response in you. So here's a little chart. Um, the number of events, so the number of times I have heard this response, or sorry, I have heard this stimulus, and how strong is my response to it. Initially, bang! Oh God, I hated that. Do it again immediately after. Well, I'm still not pleased, but it's losing its effect, right? We become less and less interested in this event. So another phenomenon you might be familiar with is it's called semantic satiation, or saturation rather. semantic saturation, where you keep repeating the same words. Repetition is key, you see. Repetition, 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 repetition. It stops having meaning after a while. You start to it just falls apart into the basic sounds of the word. The word itself stops sounding like a word. This happens naturally just by our exposure to everyday life, but yeah, words can start to lose their meaning. This is a similar idea. Your neurons just become saturated with that activity, and it stops, it becomes pointless to have the same effect over and over. So let's talk about some of the features of habituation, right? It's not like when I do this, I'm not permanently immune to all bang sounds. It's sort of a temporary effect, right? So let's look at some of the features of this process. So there's a couple of things that happen with habituation, known as recovery and relearning. So first is the idea that a stimulus will recover after it has already been habituated. So after one day, I get used to this sound, I get used to it, I'm sick of it. After some time away from the sound and away from the exposure to it, my response will return near normal. So we see down here at the bottom, on day one, we have this normal pattern of habituation, I get used to it. On day two, I've recovered almost entirely my original response. I'm still spooked by the bang, but a little less. And so that leads into the idea of relearning effects. So it takes less time to habituate after each session. You only go back so much in your learning to this extent. So yeah, these are a couple of interesting features of how this works. I mean, we have the same continuous process of habituating, but it can sort of backslide, and it has these features of you learning something the second time or being exposed to something the second time. You'll notice I keep using the idea of learning here because it's about change over time. It's related, so I'll slot it in here now and then, and it has to do with all the things we're doing here. Because remember, the context is we are working with the laws of association. How do we create new knowledge? How do we combine new ideas or old ideas into new ideas? And that ends up being quite a lot like the general process of learning. So, okay. So another tidbit to be aware of is that it's obvious that habituation is most clear when we have this observable behavior, right? Flinching or yelping because of a sound. That's the easiest way to study habituation. But it's notable that this also occurs internally. So even if I'm not, flinching or yelping or anything like that, I'm still having my internal response is still diminishing in the same way. I'm becoming less and less attuned to it. So, for example, if you have a radiator in your room that is particularly annoying, you get used to it pretty quick, right? You don't necessarily flinch at the sound of it, but you stop noticing it, right? So just wanted to make clear that this process works kind of all over the place. As wherever neurons are hanging out, habituation is something that can happen. To take that slightly deeper, it's not even always external stimuli that cause habituation. It can be internal stimuli, like your own thoughts triggering other thoughts, or your own idea, your own internal states triggering your own internal states, right? So habituation is key. It's a big piece of how neurons do some of this stuff. And we'll talk about why in a minute. So another element here is to be aware of is that the strength of the stimulus drives the strength of the response. So a loud bang versus a sort of a distant and quiet bang that's still maybe startling, but not that you don't feel like immediately threatened, right? So that process the process of habituation changes to scale with this as well. It's almost, remember back when we talked about the amount of pressure on a sensory neuron will deform the cell more and allow more response. It's the same kind of thing. A louder, stronger stimulus will trigger a stronger response in me, and thus it takes more exposures to make me get used to it. So yeah, habituation scales with the magnitude of the response. Um, so another couple of ideas here that are useful to understand about habituation, if we're going to extend this out a little bit. If our neurons are set up to habituate to individual stimuli, right? I receive stimulus over and over, and I get used to it, right? What happens if I hear a similar stimulus? And this is the idea of generalization or transfer. You might hear those ideas come up in the future, but just in life, generalization and transfer are key things here. Trying to understand how far something like this reaches. So if I have become habituated to one thing, what happens if I hear something similar to it? So similar stimuli will cause a similar reaction. That's not a bold claim, I don't think. But the question is, how similar are they? And this is back to the one of the laws of association about resemblance, right? So how do we measure the degree of similarity of two phenomena? A gunshot and a car backfiring are very similar sounds, right? But we can only say that sort of at the surface level. And that's one of the simplest ways to put it. One simple way to talk about similarity is what is the actual pattern of activation from the stimulus. Just like with the spoken word of one word kind of becoming what's unusable, right? We become saturated with a particular word. A similar word would be a word that has a lot of the same letters, right? A lot of the same pronunciation, the phonetics of the word. But the question is, will it actually have the same effect? Will I be habituated to that word? And that's actually an interesting question I don't have an answer to directly, because it would take understanding a lot about how the semantic networks all propagate their information around. Am I getting used to the sound of the word, or am I getting used to getting habituated to the semantics of the word? And that's what starts to drop off. Anyway, a curiosity for you. So, but another important use or an important way to understand similarity is actually in terms of context. So one thing that helps to make sense of this is habituation is context dependent. So habituating to a stimulus in my house, a banging or something that happens regularly, say I live near a bowling alley or something, and then hearing that same bowling pin strike sound just while I'm out walking around, that's a totally different experience, right? So I may not care about the response at home, but if I'm in a car, well, that's not exactly the same, but it's close. And then if I'm in a dark alley late at night and I hear a bang, that's probably as far away from hanging out at home as you can get. So there aren't necessarily studies on this exact thing, but the idea being this illustrates how context is a way of helping to understand similarity. My car is more similar to my home than an alley late at night is similar to my home, depending on, I guess, what my home is like. But that's it's pretty far reach. So the idea being that the way you get habituated, it requires a lot of similarity for things to continue to make sense, and that includes the context. So it's not just an individual stimulus, but it's the whole experience of being in the world and that stimulus being present, right? So you're always absorbing a little more than just one raw stimulus at a time, right? You're kind of absorbing everything. So, yeah. Okay, so another interesting feature of habituation, and this one's kind of odd. If you become totally habituated to a sound, but then you start pairing, say, that sound with a flash of light at the same time, you might suddenly recover some amount of your original response. And this is related again to the idea of context. Um, you have changed the overall pattern of the stimulus. If I'm sitting at home and I hear a bang, that's different than if I'm sitting at home, hear a bang and see a flash of light. The context and the sort of the meaning in the world of these two weird distinct stimuli have come together to be something new, and I am once again shocked by this banging and light flash situation. So, yeah, the original response can become primed again when you add new stimuli to it. So again, I hope this is painting the picture that habituation works very clearly, but there are a lot of things that kind of throw it off. Context can change, and so can just having new paired information going along with it. And it's all under the question of how similar is similar. So, yeah. So habituation at the mind level, right? This is a fundamental way in which we respond to stimuli, and also an interesting dimension we're adding here is how we do that over time, right? We're looking at a response to a stimulus over repeated exposures, how we sort of develop over time. That becomes very key because a lot of what we do with minds is over time, right? So yeah, we get used to certain stimuli. Our neurons get less and less likely to fire in that exact same pattern. And this makes a kind of sense for any existing, human being or any animal that's relying on neurons. If that sound or bang didn't hurt, then why should we keep responding to it the same way? Getting used to something is not necessarily a bad thing. It allows you to adapt to a new scenario. So something that might not initially be very pleasant, you can just sort of get used to. I think we're all familiar with that to some extent. So, especially right now. So, okay, now we've talked about the concept of habituation, how we can get used to stimuli. Let's talk about the neural basis for it. So the first evidence that leads to a good understanding of habituation in terms of neural activity comes from the sea slug, Aplysia californica. It is a mollusk, right? It's a slug. And mollusks have this wonderful feature that they have large, simple, and easy to observe nervous systems. You can see right here, so some dissected slugs. Sorry, buds. You can see the nervous system over on the right. It's central ganglia. We don't typically call them brain. I mean, they have a brain. I don't know. It's not a very elaborate brain. You can basically break it down into simple ganglial cells. But you can also see a single neuron is the size of the B on a penny in the word liberty. In these animals, that's wild. I mean, that's a lot going on, and that means it's easy to observe them and stimulate them and see what's going on, right? Always good for science when we first want to understand a thing. So let's talk about how a sea slug can get habituated. Sea slugs have a couple of features. Also, this is the bottom of a slug down here. It's not. We haven't ripped the slug open. This is just down near its pseudopod where it sticks to the glass. So sea slugs have a gill. Like many sea creatures, they have to have a gill to be able to extract oxygen from water. It's a very important piece of them. They need to keep it protected, right? So if threatened, it will withdraw the gill to protect it. If you poke it with your finger, prod this slug, it will withdraw the gill, and behind the siphon, the whole tissue kind of retracts into itself. And this behavior, this very simple reflex, can be habituated. So let's talk about that circuit. The interesting thing about these animals is that they are such simple creatures. They have so few, actual neurons firing that, again, they don't have a very robust central nervous system. They just have some helpful little neurons that let them move around in the world and do things. They're like vaguely more robotic than more complex animals. So How does this gill retraction response occur? It has a pretty short neural circuit. There is a sensory neuron in the siphon that can detect, I'm being prodded, right? It sends that information forward a bit through some interneurons. Interneurons is the term you use for the middle layer neurons when you don't really have a robust central nervous system. You have just, there happens to be some neurons, but it's not enough to say, it's sent off to the brain. And then finally, between those neurons and the gill, finally we get to the gill, and that has a motor neuron that allows it to flex and close itself, right, and retract. So, yeah, I hope that circuit makes sense, right? Information comes in, hey, I'm being pressed. Something in the middle processes that, and then the information moves on to the motor neuron, which just shuts itself down, right? So, okay, here's the question. If that's how that works, then how exactly is the habituation happening? The way we've been talking about it so far, it's this property of a mind, right? It is this thing that like, who knows how it's done? Maybe some other process, some governing process comes in and says, ooh, we no longer want to fire to this because we need to not. But remember, part of the goal of this kind of science is to get rid of that homunculus. There's not some secret little guy in there guiding things. This has to be a neural phenomenon. So, given the things we know about neurons from earlier in this course, what are some ways that a neuron might become less likely to respond? So we'll touch on a few just as we explore the question. First, inhibitory connections. This makes sense, right? An inhibitory connection can pop up and stop this current neuron from firing by giving me a stop signal, right? It can, and we know that works by way of the neurotransmitter comes in and it makes it so the polarization is less likely to happen and cause an action potential, right? So this is cool. This is not a bad idea. Some other neuron might get involved and inhibit this neuron. But this isn't quite a good explanation in this case because there's a couple of reasons. First, it's too complex. This requires some other set of neurons to be watching and regulating what is happening. And as we saw from this very simple nervous system, it just doesn't have that. So what's the deal? If this slug doesn't have any, monitoring process, it doesn't have any other neurons, how could it possibly have some kind of specialized inhibitory connection help guide it? And another piece of this is that that's actually quite slow. It's not known exactly how all inhibitory connections are formed and how quickly they are, but like, we're talking about if I poke the slug 6 times, it's going to stop responding quite so much. That's no good. I mean, that's not useful for, that makes this not a useful explanation because connecting neurons up, no matter whether it's an excitatory or inhibitory connection, it takes more than just 6 prods, typically. So, inhibitory connections is out. Another phenomenon we have is, what's another way that neurons stop firing? Well, we know about the refractory period, right? After a neuron fires, it goes into a state where it becomes much harder to fire. Also good, but this is useful. It makes it very hard to fire off again, but not quite, because this is way too short, right? Refractory periods are hundreds of milliseconds, and then they're back ready to go. And moreover, there would be no cumulative effect, right? So the idea of habituation is that it continues to decrease in its pattern over time. These neurons probably aren't, in the refractory period, the neurons kind of just bounce back near to full potential. So what else do we have left? What else would cause a neuron not to be able to communicate effectively? Hope your mind might be wandering towards neurotransmitters. This ends up being the actual case. So the neurotransmitter, that's how a cell will talk to the next cell, right? That's how a neuron will talk to a neuron. And we know a few things about them, right? We eject them out of the cell, and then they either get taken back up in full, or they break down and are reabsorbed and rebuilt, right? So, if that's the case, if I fire too often, I'm going to run low on neurotransmitter and not be able to recover it fast enough to keep firing. So this kind of works out. So let's look back at our slug. This slug, here's our friend again with its gill and siphon. It will initially, it has a very strong response. We see all the neurotransmitter bumping around, but then you can imagine how after you have ejected too much neurotransmitter, and on the little right hand diagram of the circuit, you don't really have enough neurotransmitter left to make the response happen. That gill motor neuron just doesn't, it's not interested anymore, right? It doesn't receive enough signal to activate. So this is a purely mechanical way of capturing this. And to note, in the upper left we see some evidence from these sets of studies that investigated this. As the response decreases, so does the amount of neurotransmitter in the cell. So yeah, I mean, it's a pretty strong explanation. So let's look at this again. So habituation in slugs, right? I hope this picture is pretty clear. This slug, it has habituation. It has this reduction in its response patterns. And we can see that when it's being disturbed, it kind of traces that we can see its response pattern traced directly to its neural anatomy. And it's all due to the properties of the neurons and their neurotransmitters. Habituation is just this emergent property of those things, of the fact that neurons require neurotransmitters to communicate, and it takes time for those neurotransmitters to come back. So in a slug, it's very simple. You could see, I hope, how this might scale up a bit, right? So not necessarily, it doesn't matter too much that a super complex network is doing the same thing. It still has to live by the rules of neurotransmitters. It's not something that other cells are just like kind of dropping off new packets of neurotransmitter. Oh, I heard you need these. It's still, this is how, if you activate the same network too much, it kind of loses its oomph, right? So back again to the semantic saturation of, if I keep activating the word repetition, it stops, that network gets a little tired, right? So yeah, you could see how this will scale up to a more complex scenario. That doesn't mean that it explains all behavior, right? Habituation is a fairly simple phenomenon that our neurons just happen to do, but it does have implications for how we behave in the world, and other principles rest on this. So a quick note before we keep moving on. So what about relearning? What's going on with relearning? That we know that the neurotransmitters, it's going to get reabsorbed eventually, right? So them's the rules. But other processes come into play, right? It's not just a lack of neurotransmitter that results in long-term learning. It's, new inhibitory connections are made. Maybe neuromodulation effects come in and start to change some fundamental bits. There's a lot of ways that cells do change over the long term to make things, more solidified. But it's the likely phenomenon for how that sort of day-to-day response recovery happens is more to do with like neurotransmitters and having replenished them in those particular cells. So habituation altogether, this is pretty fundamental process of the mind. You remember, we're always trying to build up and see things from a simple to a more complex phenomenon. So this idea that we have responses to the world that sort of decrease, and we get used to things in the world. We stop firing all of our neurons every time certain sounds happen around us. So this helps to describe one piece of how we live, right? The way that I can describe to you, oh, you get used to it, and that immediately makes sense to you, right? Because it's a fundamental part of our lives, getting used to different phenomena, different stimuli. But we also have this nice explanation of how that works on a neural level. So that's the concept of habituation. Now let's roll back up and revisit the laws of association. So habituation uh, showed us a little bit of some of these. Resemblance in particular, stimuli that bear resemblance will produce similar responses. And to some degree, they will share anything they've been habituated to, right? Any habituation response. Um, so, what are other ways we can connect ideas, um, especially along the lines of the laws of association? So, one major one is our friend Pavlov in the classical conditioning world and his connecting major ideas to contiguity. So, you may have heard of Pavlov. There's a fancy mustached man here, and his dogs, Pavlov's dogs, right? We'll talk about the original experiment in a moment. He was a physiologist. He was not a psychologist. He was not a cognitive scientist. He was just studying physiology. He had no strong interest in the neural underpinnings necessarily. Not zero interest, but not the goals of his studies. He was more interested in salivation. How food can trigger salivation in dogs and to what extent. He had little tubes connected to their mouths to gather spit. And it's a whole gross little study, but it's good. It's good stuff. But what he started to discover was this concept of classical conditioning. So when he or his assistants would go into the room, the dogs would start salivating before they even knew there was food necessarily, because they had somehow come to understand a connection between human is present, food is coming, right? Because food was a huge part of all these digestive studies. Dog gets excited about food long before food is even in the picture. So this is called classical conditioning, and it was developed into this idea of classical conditioning. And it's also known as the first order excitatory conditioning. That being first order as in this is the simplest first way that we can condition two things together in an excitatory way. We not inhibitory, not like this thing inhibits the other, but these things excite each other in the neural way. So, and another note is that this is the dawn of behaviorism. You may have heard, which was a strong focus on the influences of stimuli and behaviors and how they connect to one another, more so than on trying to understand what's happening inside the mind, right? That doesn't mean that we've drifted away from this because we have become much more interested in what's happening inside the mind, especially as we've been able to measure neurons a whole lot better in all the ways they work. But this was a strong movement to uncover some questions of, hey, I just want to understand behavior, and while a mind may be emitting that behavior, I'm just going to focus on the behavior. Anyway, back to understanding what classical conditioning is actually doing. So the idea comes down to associations between stimuli and their responses. We can first talk about stimuli in general. So some associations are these naturally occurring reflexes. A stimulus happens to me and I respond. And there's no learning to be done. These are like almost completely inherent. That is, you may know the fairly straightforward one here. Getting knocked on your knee with a mallet, your knee will jerk. That is a motor action that is caused by a stimulus in the world, and they naturally co-occur, right? One always leads to the other. Well, failing some certain kinds of neural struggles, but yeah. So a mallet smacking on my knee ends in me kicking up a little bit, right? Food offered to me makes me salivate a bit, right? These are not things that I control. These are not things that I have learned, really. They are things that have entirely to do with biology, right? In the former case, just the actual neurons are triggering one another when the mallet is striking me, and then for the food, that's more about, I these are kinds of instinctual things I need to survive. If I don't start salivating when food arrives, I'm oof, I'm going to have a hard time with that food. So, yeah, so naturally occurring reflexes. Another one would be a loud sound, right? A bang. You don't you don't like you don't think about, oh, should I consider that bang? But you know that loud is sort of possibly dangerous. You need to get away from something that is loud, like a falling tree, right? Um, so, but then there are other stimuli that don't evoke any kind of specific response in us. If I just see certain colors, I see a flash of light, I hear a certain noise. There are loads of neutral stimuli in the world. In fact, there's probably a vast majority more neutral stimuli than stimuli we are prone to naturally respond to. The idea of classical conditioning is how you can take all of these and combine them together to create new responses, new response pairs. So that's classical conditioning. So when we take a neutral stimulus and we can cause it to create a new response when otherwise it wouldn't have. So let's walk through it. The first step in classical conditioning is you have an unconditioned stimulus, something that just has no particular training associated with it. So food in this case, little mushroom. And then the unconditioned response is salivation. This is like Pavlov's dogs. Food and salivation, they just go naturally like that. That's how that stimulus tends to affect animals that need to eat such foods. You also have the neutral stimulus, which is just a totally unrelated stimulus, just playing a sound, right? A ding. Something that would not elicit a response, typically. So then, what you have to do to make these things become associated is you present the unconditioned stimulus and the neutral stimulus more or less at the same time. And those will then sort of together produce the unconditioned response. Really, it's still just the unconditioned stimulus producing the response, but you're now pairing this neutral stimulus with that stimulus, right? So you do this over and over. After repeated pairings of this neutral stimulus and unconditioned stimulus, these things that aren't normally related, but now, because of their contiguity in time and space, they become related. So ultimately, what you end up with is you can take the unconditioned stimulus away, and ding, I start salivating. I know, or at least I have this sort of, I have internalized this external pattern of the world that this stimulus and this sound are associated, and they cause me to salivate, right? They both mean food time, more or less, right? So the neutral stimulus becomes the conditioned stimulus, which creates the conditioned response, with none of the original stimulus present anymore. So this is cool. This is interesting. An important piece of this, for the way it's being described, is I've used a little bit of like sort of mental life terminology, like, oh, I know that these two things mean that they signal one another, that kind of thing. But in classical conditioning, in behaviorism, they were pretty exclusively talking about, look, we don't know what the thing knows. We don't know what the animal knows. We don't know. We have no way of measuring that. So they speak exclusively in this stimulus response terminology. But it does a good job of describing the process of acquiring one of these new paired understandings. So let's look at a little bit more of this. How does this happen over time? Well, it has a sort of a power curve, a diminishing return sort of curve, and what this shows is every time you pair a stimulus, like an unconditioned stimulus with the neutral stimulus, you will increase the probability and strength of the response. So at the start, the dog might not kind of notice that there will be a small extra salivation, and it's not going to happen every time. But as you continue to do this, as you continue to expose the dog to the ding and the food together, the ding kind of grows in its associative strength, right? It presenting the ding after only 2 trials not going to have a strong or consistent effect. But after 50 trials, 100 trials, 1,000 trials, the association is very strong, so that it almost always happens, and it will be a near full strength response, almost as if the food was actually present. So you can see how this leads to the concept of, the we things that we experience become paired. But okay, here's the question: is this forever? Is this dog eternally going to salivate after dings? The answer is, of course, no, because whatever you can build up in this in this world of neurons, you can also untrain, right? But the question is, how does that happen? So, like, what is the pattern? So, the process of losing one of these associations in classical conditioning is called extinction. Oh, as usual. Sorry. Extinction. So we present, if you present the conditioned stimulus without the unconditioned stimulus, do the ding without the food, you kind of, it would make sense that you might start to lose that association, right? Just because something always was paired and now it's not paired anymore, I don't maintain the old delusion. Doesn't mean nothing is left of the association, but it still decreases as you get used to the new situation, that these two things are not associated, right? So here we'll look at some patterns over time. So initially we train just like normal. You present the conditioned stimulus with the unconditioned stimulus, and the response goes up, right? We see more and more salivation for the ding when you are presenting the stimulus and both stimuli together, right? But each new day, let's say we walk the dog into the lab and we just ring a bell. Right off the bat, the dog will start to salivate, right? Almost as strong as yesterday, because they still have this association paired. They still experience this. There's a sort of, I am preparing to eat, right? Because I know the ding, I know what that means. But it drops off, and it drops off pretty precipitously. It only takes a few presentations without the ding without the food for the dog to stop salivating. The dog starts to realize what's going on. Day 3, this happens faster. They start lower and they go back. Start lower, go back, and eventually it's such a low response that you might as well consider them to be not especially related anymore. Think about how this relates to habituation. It has kind of the same pattern, right? The first response, I'm very strong, but as it's presented over and over, I sort of lose the connection to it, right? I'm thinking less and less that, maybe this ding doesn't mean food. But given enough time, given a whole day, I do jump back up to a certain amount of the same, ding means food, right? So it has this flavor of conditioning sets some new baseline, and then we perturb it. We shake loose from that normal pattern. The new normal is dings mean food, and habituation to the idea that, maybe dings don't mean food, right? I'm not saying that this is the exact same process, but it has the same sort of neural flavor, right? This recovery and then decrement. But that's extinction. This is the idea that eventually this newly trained conditioned response will go extinct. It will vanish. But sometimes you can actually have spontaneous recovery. So if you have been exposing the animal to this, ding without food, they'll get, every day you do that for a little while, they get sort of used to the idea, okay, ding doesn't mean food anymore. But then if you go a long time, say, nearly a week, without any kind of training at all, so no new pairings of the unconditioned stimulus with nothing, right? You're not presenting the bell without any food. You're just not doing anything. You're not training the animal at all. Then after a week or so, you go in, you ring the bell, and we've recovered. The animal has gone back to, here comes food, you know. So, yeah, this is an interesting feature of it. This shows a little bit of a difference from some of the other patterns we looked at, in that you can sort of reset to the baseline of, or rather the new baseline of having learned this thing. There's a lot of complexities that go into that, but I just hope it's showing how this sort of training pattern, this is a little bit more longer term, right? Conditioning can last a while with you, and that's related to how we can learn long-term things and not just have sort of short-term learning patterns. Another interesting one is if you have totally extinguished a condition response, right? You have every day you ring the bell with no food. The dog gets totally used to this new normal, says, okay, fine, there's no food with bells. But sometimes presenting that conditioned stimulus with a new neutral stimulus, so after a while, I've trained the dog to not really care about the bell anymore so much, but if I play the bell and flash a light, bang, the original conditioned response comes back. So I hope you can see the parallels to this sort of the context sensitivity, right? This is super weird, right? Just at its face value. But this is showing that, like, there is something retained even though extinction occurs. Even though you lose some of this pattern, you retain some semblance of it that can get reactivated in weird back channels. So, okay. This, just some interesting features of classical conditioning. But I hope it's showing that this is sort of the first step into saying, how do I bind up two ideas together, right? How can we pair distinct phenomena as related, right? So I see apple on branch, I start to understand that apples do grow on trees, right? Because they always happen together. This is that. This is the idea of learning learning associations by way of contiguity, given an actual mechanism, sort of an explanation, a mechanical explanation of, you present these things that causes this chain reaction that makes a new bit of knowledge, a new bit of understanding of the world. So, and it makes sense that we would want to do this. If I want to ring a bell with dinner every night, I should start to connect that, right? I should know that bell means dinner. In fact, that's kind of the point of a dinner bell. But this also kind of opens the door a little bit, and I would just ask you to reflect briefly on what kinds of things might you just be automatically pairing together, unrelated stimuli, unrelated things in your life that just happen to all be happening at the same time. And is that good or bad? You don't have to have an answer, but this is just, it's a useful thing to keep in mind, that you might be picking up associations between things that you don't necessarily want or need. This is part of that, I've mentioned before, it can get really weird studying the mind because, hey, you have one. And in fact, that is the thing you are using to study. But this is, no worries. This is an important step in the process of studying the mind, is questioning how yours is handling things. And in that same spirit, now I want to walk through a little bit of a scientific exploration of classical conditioning, right? We want to interrogate how exactly does classical conditioning work, and what are some competing theories within it. So, great. We have another fundamental process of associating ideas. But the question is, what are the mechanisms of this thing? We have the pairings, right? We have how we know that presenting two stimuli together makes them both sort of elicit the same response. But the question is, how exactly is the neutral stimulus getting to the response, right? How does the bell, what's the process the information from the bell goes through to cause this salivation? in the animal, right? Because remember, we're down to neurons. We're trying to ask how the heck does this function? And there's two competing theories for this. The first is the stimulus response hypothesis, and the second is the stimulus hypothesis. We'll do them each. So stimulus response hypothesis. This is that neutral stimuli can be linked directly to the new conditioned response. So the idea being that in the machinery of the dog's mind, the bell just means salivate now. There's no intermediary step. It's just now after so long of building up this understanding, the bell rings and I salivate, right? The stimulus hypothesis says, well, hang on, what if it's a little bit different? What if the neutral stimulus links to the unconditioned stimulus, our idea of it, right? The internal understanding of the unconditioned stimulus, which is then what prompts the conditioned response. So the dog hears the bell, it evokes some kind of memory or some sort of internal pattern related to food, and then food is what triggers the salivation response, right? I mean, it doesn't, and that could be as much as like a full-blown, oh, I am remembering food, as like a really conscious experience, or it can be a lot more subtle and distributed. But the idea being, is the original stimulus still part of the equation, even as an internal representation? So let's look. Let's find out. That's one of the questions here in this set of studies we're about to go through. So the question ends up being, what would happen to a conditioned response if I weakened the original unconditioned association of the reflex? What if I habituated you to your original reflex, got rid of it, and then I tried to ring the bell? What if I made a dog think, oh, this kind of food is not good, right? This kind of food makes me sick. Well, I don't want to poison a dog, but giving the dog this exposure that, hey, just because you see food doesn't mean you're going to get it. That's how we have, dogs at dinner tables, right? We try to do that at least. So that is the question. What do each of these hypotheses predict? First one is stimulus response. Hey, no problem. If you get rid of the original response, it doesn't matter because I'm a brand new thing. I'm just a wholly unconnected new response pattern that has nothing to do with the old one. But stimulus theory, the hypothesis is, shoot, I can't. That's not good for me because the original association is a big part of how the new association works. So let's follow along with Rescorla in their 1973 study to figure out how to handle this. So like I said before, how do you weaken a response? We already know, habituation. We can make the original reflex kind of useless, right? And that introduces this conditioned suppression paradigm. So a couple basic idea is you train up a new response from pairing some neutral stimulus with a reflex, right? Just like we've just walked through, right? The whole process. You make a new conditioned response. And then you habituate that reflex to see what happens with the new conditioned response, right? So let's talk about the setup of this study. Rescorla, their plan was, the first step is, and actually, here's a quick, interesting little aside. This was a kind of a booming time. You see it's as late as 73, but, behaviorism was a few decades before that, up into this time period. And this was kind of a booming time for, oh, hey, I can train up whatever responses I want. And because you can use a conditioned response to trigger another conditioning event and another conditioning event, it made it very easy to design these studies where you could sort of chain together, oh, I want this exact strength of a response, and I want to test how much how that much altering that triggers a new response. I'm waving my hands right now, you can't see it. You don't need to focus on that, but it's just a cool time because the idea was, oh, we can play around with this. And so Rescorla did. As you'll see in their first setup, the very first thing is to train a rat to enjoy pulling a lever for food. I use the word enjoy here. I mean, really, that's just train a rat to pull a lever. And this was conditioning, right? The rat likes to pull the lever, receives food. This is like the baseline. So this is just a very basic situation. We've given the rat reason to want to be near the lever, right? So now we can play with that, and don't feel too bad for the rat. They were super well fed in all these old studies. They led pretty decent little lives. But the unconditioned stimulus in this case now is I'm going to make a loud noise, right? The response is the rat avoids the lever. The loud noise is next to the lever. The rat avoids the lever because I don't like this. I don't like loud sounds, right? And then the conditioned stimulus is I'm going to flash a light with the noise. So now if I just flash a light, the rat will avoid the lever. Just doesn't like it, right? We create this new conditioned response. So to illustrate, here's a mouse, little rat, and next to a lever, right? This is the default. Hey, I like to be here. I want to be here. I want to go get food from this lever. Then play that loud sound. Ugh, I hate this. My unconditioned stimulus is this loud sound. Unconditioned response is I'm going away from the lever. Then we do the pairing. Unconditioned response still happens with the neutral stimulus paired up. And then finally, the now conditioned stimulus creates the conditioned response. Now, you can probably see where this is going, especially because the focus of the habituation discussions have been on sound. So, now we habituate the rat to the loud noise just by repeating exposure to it, right? The rat starts to feel less and less perturbed by this loud noise, just like we've seen before, right? So the idea here being that this should weaken that association. This should make it so that the rat is no longer the foundation on which the conditioned stimulus and response was built has eroded. We have gotten rid of it. We've said, hey, this rat is no longer totally afraid of this sound. What happens to that conditioned response? Well, the result is this significantly reduced the conditioned response. The light no longer produced an avoidance response, even though they didn't habituate the light. They didn't mess with the light. So, which theory is this playing with? Weakening that unconditioned stimulus to unconditioned response pair also weakened the conditioned stimulus to conditioned response pairing. So that means the stimulus-stimulus theory is supported. So the idea being that if I screw up the original, I have also screwed up the new one. It didn't short circuit its way around it. It didn't create a new, totally independent association. It's actually sort of chained. The association is chained to the original actual experience. So this is cool. This is showing a little bit more about how the patterns and the mechanisms of some of our simple associative machinery works. But it's good to take an aside on these things and say, hey, stimulus-stimulus theory is good for explaining these initial findings, but there's a lot of weaknesses to these kinds of things. So just to point out that this doesn't explain the full breadth of human experience and the whole mind and the brain and everything, right? Conditioning works, but there's a whole lot other stuff going on. So the conditioned response is often similar, but not the same as the unconditioned response, right? So I might flinch differently, or I will, the actual response I give to a flash of a light that I've learned to avoid versus the bang of a sound I've learned to avoid, they're different, right? They still produce a response, but they're a little different. And the problem is that's not well explained by this theory, right? Not just the stimulus-stimulus theory, but all of conditioning. And the way that you respond can differ. It was shown that dogs' saliva changed in thickness and chemical composition when there was actually food versus when there was just the promise of food by a bell. Um, and if you're using some of these studies use painful stimuli, so a pinprick, a shock, that kind of stuff. Not the most fun, but it's the idea of asking, does this work in the negative as well? And the trick here, though, is the problem with this general theory is the response that I'm training isn't pain; it ends up being fear and avoidance. So again, it's not the raw experience of pain as a response that's being stimulated. It's some other system is involved here. An emotional system is involved. And then finally, an important piece of this is that not all of the unconditioned response is part of the conditioned response, right? So there's a whole lot of things that showing food to a dog does to that dog. If you've ever fed a dog, you know that a lot of them, they go full wiggle town, right? Their whole body gets involved. They do salivate for sure, but all kinds of other stuff happens. So, and the other stuff doesn't happen as much or even in the same way as the original food stimulus when you're just doing the bell, right? So, yeah, these are the ins and outs of a bit of the conditioning paradigms. Really cool stuff, I think. I think this together with habituation show sort of some really basic ways that ideas can be connected. And that's where we're at, right? We're trying to build a mind, and as we tend to do, we start from the basics and work our way up. So we have habituation, which is this natural reduction to a single stimulus, just a repeated stimulus. That's something that happens to us with this interesting neural basis for it, right? Our C-slug friend. And then classical conditioning, which is how you can pair two different distinct ideas together just because they're related. They're concurrent in the same place and time. So they are contiguous, to use the wording of the laws of association. And so these are fairly simple mechanisms of mind. They're complex mechanisms from looking down from the neural level, like, oh my gosh, how does this all happen? But from looking up from the level of the mind and how we process information, this is pretty simple for our day-to-day life. These are basic mechanisms of how we associate stimuli. So, yeah, I hope that illuminates a little bit. Next time we will have a look at a little bit more of these laws of association, get some more contiguity, and then more on contingency, also known as causation. So, all right, take care.